My name is Alexander Kraft. I'm one of the lead instructors here at CyberWarrior. Today we're going to be doing an identity management masterclass. Before I get started, just a little introduction for myself so you don't think they just pulled somebody off the street to do this. I actually work as an enterprise architect and cloud engineer for a large organization. So this is part, and it's integrated into identity management. It has a lot to do with this kind of stuff. As an administrative point, if anybody has a question throughout the entire presentation, I'll repeat this, probably a lot more people join, but you can always just put it in the chat. I have my chat up so I can see it during the presentation. So just feel free to ask any questions that you have. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I have to. I should probably share my screen. That would probably help. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. This is the Introduction to Identity Management Masterclass. Okay, the overview of what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about an overview of identity management, what that means, how do we put that into practice, and what technologies actually support that in today's climate. The importance of identity management, what is it actually used for, and what are the multiple different facets in which we can use technology to manage identity. We're going to talk about some of the different components of identity management and some of the best practices to go along with that as well. And then we're going to go over a couple of case studies of where this was actually implemented and very successful. And then we will end with a Q&A. Okay. So the overview for identity management. What is identity management? Why is it important? Well, the definition of identity management, it's oftentimes abbreviated to identity and access management, or IAM, or just IDM is identity management. It is basically a process of finding or defining digital identities and then managing permissions to those identities after a verification process has taken place. This will make a little bit more sense in a moment, but that's the overall idea of what identity management is. We utilize identity management a lot of different ways. For instance, we can utilize it to connect to web resources like websites and web applications. We can use it to log into client desktops and laptops and things like that that are joined to a domain, to manage the amount of people and who we let onto our networks and how do we verify that they are who they say they are. This is all falling under the identity management umbrella. Now, where the access management comes in is after we've identified somebody successfully, we can actually assign permissions to what they're supposed to be able to do on our network if they were allowed into our network in the first place. So what's the importance of this? The importance of identity management plays a pretty significant role for safeguarding our data. In cybersecurity, one of the largest things that we're concerned with all the time is our is the data and data protection. There's so many different facets of data protection in IT and cybersecurity. It kind of encompasses a very large portion of cybersecurity in general. So the importance of data is obviously very crucial. It's part of what we know as the CIA triad, which is the confidentiality portion of the CIA triad. This means that we have to keep confidential information confidential. We have to protect the integrity. We can only do this and protect the integrity of a system by managing who is able to access that system. So these are both what identity management basically is and how it is important in today's climate. So some of the important pieces of identity management break down like this. You have security as a primary component, and I'll get a pen out here, but you have security as a primary component, and identity management basically falls into all three versions of the CIA triad. So the CIA triad breaks down into confidentiality, integrity, and availability of a system. No matter what certification or what field of study you take in cybersecurity, it will all lead back to this fundamental concept of CIA. So we're trying to prevent the confidentiality or the secrecy of information that should only be shared between a set group of people. This could be trade secrets, this could be sensitive information, things of that nature, only between the people that should have access to that information. So identity management is a direct correlation to the confidentiality of data. The next portion is the integrity of data. this basically means if somebody were to try and modify a piece of data, they should not be able to modify it if they do not have the proper permissions to modify it. Now, the only way we can really manage the permissions on any entity in a network is we have to make an identity for somebody and then assign permissions and things like that to those people. We'll talk a little bit more granular about how that works in a moment, but that fundamental concept shows you that only people that should be allowed to modify data is the ones we're actually trying to control with identity management. And then availability, certain permissions allow you to not only view data and things like that, but maybe destroy data or alter data in a way that it's irrecoverable. Think malware or crypto malware, or just simply turning off a system or breaking the operating system because you have access to it. This can all affect the availability of a system, the third leg of the CIA triad, allowing systems to go down when we're trying to maintain their availability, because IT systems without availability are basically useless to everybody, regardless of their cybersecurity posture. So it stands as one of the primary legs as well. The next portion of why identity management is important is we have compliance. Now, there are a lot of regulatory compliances ever since, let's say, 1987, or even before then when the Computer Security Act was first introduced. But these kind of things become very critical when we're talking about extremely sensitive data. So an example of the sensitive data that you may see is things like PII, and I'll write this down. You have personally identifiable information, or PII. This is things like social security numbers, birth dates, and so on. Then you have things like PHI, which is personal health information. And then you also have other sensitive information like it could be a lot of different things, but let's say like financial information. This doesn't exactly have a straight designation for what the kind of, like, there's no acronym exactly for that, but financial information from somebody's private finances. There are regulatory compliances that kind of match each one of these types of data, that we basically setting a guideline or a framework, if you will, to say how we are supposed to manage our IT systems and what controls we have to have in place to protect this certain type of sensitive information. And every single one of it, you probably guessed, has some entries in it that have to do with identity management. It's kind of a central thing for all of these. So for PII, we have things like GDPR. We have Computer Security Act, Computer Privacy Act, things like that. We also have PHI, which is HIPAA information. It's actually spelled it wrong. Whoops. I always put two P's there, but it's HIPAA, Availability Act. So HIPAA information protects our private health information, that's sensitive type of data. And then financial information can be protected by a lot of big things, but one of the primary ones is something like PCI DSS. PCI DSS is a regulatory framework that is there to primarily protect credit cards and payment card information. So if you've ever given your credit card to a company and told it to save it, like Amazon or something like this, they have to maintain certain regulatory compliances under this framework to make sure that your data is not lost or being able to be accessed by people that have no business seeing it. So compliance plays a big role in identity management, and identity management plays a good role in compliance as well. And then we have efficiency. Now, we can make an argument for all sorts of different methodologies for identifying somebody to a system. You could do username and password, you could do a token, you can do biometrics. There's a lot of different ways to manage identities and show these kind of things. There's a few that basically are used at the enterprise level and are the most efficient means of doing so, but there are lots of ways to do it. So the efficiency portion of this basically comes down to a couple of things. Efficiency comes down to being able to streamline the process quicker and so on. So we have standards that exist to allow us to pass identification information between a person that wants to log into a system, the user, and a web application or a laptop or a desktop. Some of these technologies are things like Active Directory. I'll just put AD for short. We have SAML. It's a markup language for identity. We have OIDC. We have OAuth. It's supposed to be an A. I spelled that totally bad. OAuth. And these are primarily used for authenticating to web applications. So there are a lot of different things that exist out there at an enterprise level, a business level, to provide us a means to manage and send identities over a network, and also store identities in a local location to actually manage them that way. And then the customer experience. There are a lot of ways, like we said, to manage identity, but some of the ways that we can manage it make it very difficult for somebody to even access a system. Everybody in the class right now probably has had a time in their careers that they've tried to get something to work, just get into it, and all these cybersecurity steps or all these methods to try and protect your system actually end up so you can't even get into it. It's so difficult that you can't even access your system. This is a pretty common thing. So there are technologies that exist to enhance the customer experience when also dealing with identity management. One of the primary ones that we'll be talking about is SSO, or single sign-on. And there's also things like MFA, or multi-factor authentication. And the technologies that have been developed around these two technologies has basically increased exponentially over the last 10 years to make somebody to make the technology more seamless when somebody's trying to use it, and to provide more functionality and easier implementation on both aspects of that. So the components of identity management break down like this. You'll basically have to look at the identity management. We'll have to get familiar with these different terms before we can kind of do anything else with it. So these are not very hard. There's actually one that's a little bit kind of mixed in here, and it's identity verification, but we'll talk about them. There's actually something called the AAA framework as well. It's a different thing to define stuff, but it kind of includes these three. So let's start with the first one. It's authentication. There's technically one above it that we should start with, I guess, and that's identification. Okay, we have identification. Anybody probably knows what this means. If anybody you've ever been pulled over by the police or done anything, gone into any location where it was restricted access for some reason, you have to provide some kind of identity, like identification card or token or password or something like that. All this portion of the identity management does is just say who you are. It does not, in essence, really help who you are. Anyway, it says who you are. It doesn't exactly help verifying that that is a true statement or anything like that, but it does actually provide some kind of document or some kind of resource that says that this is who I am. That in itself is a form of control of identity management, because not everybody is willing to go to the lengths to doctor a token or a password or a username or stuff like that. So it kind of is a first step in identity management, but it doesn't prove you are who you say you are. I can say that I'm Elvis Presley, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean anything. Even if I have a driver's license that says I'm Elvis Presley, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It just says that's who I am. It's not exactly who I am. So this is where the next step of this comes in, and this is authentication. This is the step in identity management, especially for digital IDs and things like that, where somebody verifies you are who you say you are. So you can say I'm Elvis Presley, but let me look at that driver's license and it doesn't say Elvis Presley on it. That verifies that I'm actually lying, or verifies I am telling the truth. If I handed them one that said my name was Alexander, it would be accurate because it would match, and you can authenticate against some resource that you trust, like a driver's license is an example of that. Okay, now in an enterprise environment, we have databases of users. So if you provide a username to a system like Active Directory, for instance, it goes to its database and it looks up your name, whatever username, or it's called logon name, that you enter. It references that with an account, and then it asks you for a password to authenticate that you are the person that is supposed to have access to that account. Now, this is done through the method of providing a password or providing a token or something like that. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. The point is that once you provide that password or that verification document, token, whatever you have, that is the authentication piece saying only the person that owns this account or is this person should have that password. So that's a means in which I can authenticate them. And then finally, we have the next step is authorization. I like to use a kind of analogy to explain authorization the easiest way. Sometimes you can go into a business and let's say this is Bob the janitor. Bob the janitor could say, hey, I'm Bob the janitor. They're allowed to have identification. They're allowed to have authentication into a building, but maybe they're not allowed into the financial records of that building, or they're not able to access certain information on their databases because they're a janitor and they just have no reason to get to that stuff. So authorization is who needs to know, or what are you allowed to access? It basically authorizes you to a specific resource or group of resources based on what your role is or what your job is, right? And there's a lot of different ways to manage that. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. So identification, say who I am. Authentication, prove that that's who I am. And authorization, now that you've proved that's who you are, what are you allowed to access based on why you're here? Okay. And then we have identity verification. There are a lot of different ways to do identity verification in identity management. But one of the biggest things is usually providing some kind of personal information, providing biometric information, or some kind of token or physical object that you own to basically authenticate yourself or prove you are the person you say you are. So this is identity verification. Then we have provisioning. This is the creation, and the way it's used inside of IT and cybersecurity means something different than it does in a normal sentence. So if I say I bought provisions, that means like I bought food or I bought something that's sustenance. But if I use it in an IT term, it means to create or manage or modify a resource, usually specific to identity management. So this is what identity management means when I say provisioning. So if I'm going to provision you an account, it means I'm going to basically create an account or manage an account that's already set up for you, okay? And then we have single sign-on, very commonly known as just SSO. A lot of people just say SSO for short. SSO provides us to a single identity provider, and this is just like a drawing to kind of visualize this a little bit better. Say I have things like Microsoft Office 365. I have Power BI, another Microsoft product. I have the Azure portal or Azure or something like that. I can use a specific identity provider to connect all of these devices to that identity provider. So instead of having a user over here, we'll just call this one user one. Instead of having user one go to every one of these resources individually, that would be very encumbersome. They'd have to log into 365, Power BI, the portal. They'd have to go to their Outlook, log in again. They'd have to go to everything and log in again. We actually just do one authentication to an identity provider, commonly known as an IDP. And then once that identity provider has authorized you and authenticated you properly, then you can get to all these resources through a authorization token or ticket, depending on the technology, that lets you access all these resources without having to individually re-authenticate to them. There is already a trust relationship in this example between Office 365, Power BI, the portal, with whatever identity provider that they're connected to. There's a lot of different ones. So all I have to do is authenticate to the identity provider, and then I am allowed into all of these services that are underneath that umbrella that those already have an inherent trust relationship with. Okay. So we're going to talk about some of the best practices moving forward with identity management now that we have a good fundamental understanding of how that's managed. One of the things we have is strong password policies. Now, it might come as a surprise to you that the password policies that the National Institute for Security, for Security Technology, NIST itself, one of the large organizations that manages most of the frameworks and guidance for managing cybersecurity at an enterprise level, doesn't really have strong policies on passwords. There's two things that they primarily look for, and the things to make your password stronger is length. Length is one of the largest things that increases the complexity. Length, non-repeating. And not personal. So not like a name of your dog or your high school mascot or something like that. Okay. If it's not these things, it means that your password is relatively strong. Now, a lot of times when you sign up to passwords, it won't say that, but the official guidance on it does not really care if you have capitals or you have lower cases, if you have special characters or not. It doesn't actually mention almost any of that. It actually says length, non-repeating, not personal. Now, obviously, if you put special characters into a password, if it allows it, it'll increase the complexity extremely, but it is not necessary to increase the difficulty from a starting point. And then, so this is like the password policies that we can put in place when setting policies. And if you're in an Active Directory environment, you can do this via group policy. There's a lot of ways to do it, or you can just disable passwords altogether. It's kind of up to you. Then we have multi-factor authentication. We do have MFA, and we spoke about it shortly. MFA basically is a methodology of using identity management to make sure to get an extra step of verification when we authenticate people to a network. So let's go with the example that I had before. Let's say that I'm going to say that I'm Elvis and I'm trying to log into my domain. What I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to offer multi-factor authentication. The system is going to basically ask me to provide multiple factors, and they break down like this. It's what you know, what you have, what you are, what you do, have, know, are, do, and that's basically. There's actually some other ones as well, but these are some of the big ones. Okay, so something that you know is something like a password, right? A PIN, things of that nature, right? And then something you have is something like a token, a smart card, or a USB, like a YubiKey or something like that. Like there's a lot of different technologies. That's just one example of them. Something you are is biometrics, so fingerprint, iris scan, things like that, so on. And something that you do is a little bit more complex. There's not a lot of these out there, but one of the most common ones is signature analysis. Only you sign your signature the same way, the exact same way, right? So it's something that you do. Now that one's not infallible, but that's the idea. So MFA only actually enables itself, or you're only actually using MFA when you have two of the following categories from this list. If I have a password and a PIN, that is not considered MFA. That is considered single sign or single factor authentication. And if I have something I know and something I have, so a token and a PIN, or a fingerprint scan and a password, that means that I'm providing MFA. Now, MFA has been proven through a lot of testing to be the most effective way to manage identity and authentication to a system. That's why it's a universal standard for almost any organization at this point. You can even use your phone at this point in applications like Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, and a few others as well. Samsung Authenticator, there's text messages, SMS push notifications. There's a lot of different things that you can utilize for this multi-factor authentication. The phone, in that case, acting as the thing that you have from this list of things. And then we have regular access reviews. Some of the best practices when utilizing is actually to go through our permission sets on a regular basis to make sure that only the people that need access to what they have access to do. Now, there are a lot of technologies that exist out here to query that information, a lot of automated scripts, PowerShell scripts, and things like that for Active Directory. And if we're talking on the cloud, this is kind of some built-in tools that are able to do this as well. But either way, reviewing that on a regular basis to make sure that it doesn't get out of hand, that people aren't getting crazy permissions that they shouldn't have, we have to do a regular access review. And one of the next technologies we'll talk about here actually helps us manage this kind of creeping of permissions and kind of keep it confined. That next technology is what's known as role-based access control. There are a lot of different models for enabling identity management or accessing it and showing which way should we actually manage this, right? One of the most important ways is role-based, and it's one of the most commonly used ones in Azure and AWS and GCP or Google Cloud. All of them use a role-based access control methodology. And what this looks like is the traditional way of doing things would be you'd have a user, let's just call this user one again. So you have user one, and user one is going to access a file share or something like that. He wants to get to a set of files that he wants. Now, the traditional way of doing this would be that this file group could either be managed individually. You could say, okay, this user one has access to that. That's known as DAC, or discretionary access control. Fast forward a little bit to the future, because discretionary access control was primarily a Linux and Unix derivative technology. That's what they use to manage files and still do to this day, realistically. You have files that you can then assign different groups to these files, saying that if the user is actually in this group, and I'm going to check if it's in that group, then they're able to do certain things to those files, like read, write, execute, modify those files based on this criteria. And then we assign the files to a security group, and then we assign the user to the security group so they can kind of authenticate via each other. The file says, do you have access to that group? And then the user says, yes, I do have access to that group. I'm in that security group. Let me see the files. So this is one way to do it. And the more common way to do it now is that we have a bunch of different security groups. I'll just put SG for these. We have a bunch of different security groups now. And the same thing applies here, where we can have different groups assigned to different files. But we have all of these groups kind of added together into what's called a role, which is just a combination of groups. That's all it really is. And then we assign the user. I'm running out of space here, so I'm going to make a long line here. We assign the user to this instead of individually showing them the group. You can imagine that if I was to assign every user a bunch of groups for a bunch of different files, it would be very difficult to track who has permission to what and how I should manage that. But if you have roles, you can just assign people to those singular roles, 4 or 5 roles maybe, and then you can see, is this person's job in correlation with those roles? Now, the problem isn't they have access to something that, or they need access to something that they don't have access to. It turns into, I need to modify my role to better fit that role and what they need access to. So we're not managing things at a user level much anymore. We're going to the roles and directly managing those roles and what permissions need to be assigned for those jobs that those people are doing. Okay, so this is role-based access control, and this is the most common method that is utilized today. And then we have things like centralized identity management systems. There are a lot of different systems out there. I kind of mentioned a couple of them before, but 2 of the biggest ones, if we're talking about Microsoft, just in general, is going to be Active Directory. This is a database and authentication system to manage roles, groups, and access to different things. And then we have a newer technology, something that used to be known as Azure AD. It's not called that anymore. We actually call it Entra ID now. So it's Entra ID. And we're able to leverage these technologies, both Active Directory, and they can actually be coupled together to do identity management. So we can import things into Active Identity or Active Directory straight from Entra, or the opposite. We can pull things directly from Active Directory to replicate over to Entra ID, so they can kind of be mirrored. So we don't have to recreate accounts on both. They can kind of do this automatically. So with these centralized management systems, we're allowed to create things, and Entra ID actually has default roles that they create without you having to do any extra work. So you have default roles, and then you have things like security groups and and things like that. Those exist in Entra ID as well as Active Directory, although there is a little bit of a difference on how things are managed in Active Directory. And this kind of applies to all types of cloud providers, that things like Entra ID or identity management systems in the cloud are what's called like a flat structure. They don't have like groups of roles or groups of things in them. It's everything exists on one level. There's no directories and subdirectories and OUs and things like that. None of that exists. It exists on one plane where every group and every role exists in one place, and then you assign those more granularly to what you need those roles to do. Whereas something like Active Directory has what are called trees and leaves, where we have little kind of branches of different networks, not networks, but like we have different little branches that break off into all these different subcomponents of how we want to manage one set of devices or users and another set of devices and users. And you manage that a lot more granularly that way. So they're a little bit different at some level, but the central idea of having one place that I can go to authenticate to a system and make sure that that person has access to the proper things is kind of identical between them. So let's talk about some of the case studies moving forward. One of the most important case studies that happened recently was Microsoft Corporation. They actually had a lot of problems cropping up with Microsoft Active Directory. It was really the only way to do things about 10 years ago or something like that. It was the leading cutting edge. It was the best management system out there for large enterprise networks. So basically everything used it. So Microsoft Corporation eventually, went to the cloud about 10 years ago at this point. It's actually been around longer, but really seriously about 10 years now. They started to leverage things like Entra ID, or what it used to be called Azure Active Directory. And it allowed us to start enabling things like multi-factor authentication, role-based access control, and start streamlining some of the user onboarding. So we could actually just, if they had a Microsoft account, for instance, this is a nice thing about Entra ID or Entra, is if you already have a Microsoft account or an email account, you can actually just invite somebody via whatever email they provide, and you can create them a temporary account to have access to whatever resources they want in the environment. This is a way to very quickly onboard people, even if they're just contractors and things like that, working for your company. You can just invite them, they can accept, and then you can assign them roles, and they just log into your system with their email and a password that was set, or some kind of multi-factor authentication that you set. So this is a very big deal as far as identity management went, for that exact reason. Now, there are some regulatory frameworks, and we'll talk about that again, that are kind of included in that. And two of the most important ones are, I'll just talk about one of them just for the sake of time. We have something known as GDPR. And we talked slightly about this before, but Microsoft, in the implementation of things like Azure or Entra ID, kind of allowed us to come into compliance with GDPR. Now, GDPR is actually a European regulatory framework. It's not a United States or any other country framework. Now, some people adopted very similar things and usages, but GDPR is primarily European Union, right? What it basically means is if I went to a website and I accessed that website, let's say, it asked me for certain information from me. It asked me for my first name, last name, credit card details, perhaps, I don't know. You could just say like birth date is a good example of that, and things like that. So it asks you for some information that identifies you. We could even call this PII. This information could then be, and this is what happens in the United States a lot, depending on the state you live in. This information can get sold to other organizations that have nothing to do with the original organization that you were doing business with. So all this information will then be stored on their databases, making it more dangerous, because the more copies of your information that there are, the more dangerous this becomes to keep it private, right? This is why identity theft is kind of rampant. So GDPR basically is a framework that basically does not allow people to do this. It has to ask, in another analogy, it works good. Now, I might give somebody, if I'm playing with them with a toy of some kind, I can give them a toy and I can say, this is what you're allowed to do with this toy. You're allowed to play with it. You're allowed to go outside with it. You're allowed to come inside with it. You're allowed to do whatever. But I have to strictly define what you're allowed to do with that toy. And only you're allowed to do what I've strictly defined for. So GDPR works a lot of the similar way with information or personal information, that I can tell you if you're allowed to sell it. I can tell you if you're allowed to share it with people, but you're only allowed to share certain types of information, and you're only allowed to share it with certain types of organizations. This stuff is all defined with GDPR. Now, this kind of happens behind the scenes when you do user agreements and services, but either way, they're not allowed to sell your information to anybody that they want to make a lot of money. This is kind of something that they're very limited to under GDPR. So protecting your information and making sure that it's not being transmitted or even accessible to other organizations is like kind of a central point of that. So the granularity of Microsoft Corporation's introduction of Entra ID and other technologies like that kind of enabled them to be a lot closer compliance with GDPR because they're a multinational organization. So this is something that was a really big boost to their organization. That was good. And then we have Equifax. Equifax is a credit reporting agency in the United States. It's one of the three major ones. They faced a lot of identity management practices problems in 2017. They actually lost, or it was compromised, over 147 million people's information. They were using extremely outdated procedures for identity management. They had very vulnerable softwares running in their organization that was never being updated. There's a lot of things going on that kind of compiled to make this big, huge problem that led to one of the largest data breaches basically ever, one of them. So Equifax kind of did not have identity verification systems like MFA or second party identity providers. None of these things that we've been talking about that are really good technologies to utilize. So a lot of people were able to exploit those weaknesses and gain unauthorized access to that sensitive data that was being stored there. And it was a lot of, because it's credit reporting, it has a lot of basically sensitive information. They suffered a very large reputation problem, and the company faced a lot of legal consequences over the following years, including regulatory fines, class action lawsuits, for failing to stay in compliance with some of the regulatory frameworks we talked about. So some of the lessons learned that we can take away from this is they can highlight the importance of implementing effective identity management with some of the technologies that we've been talking about: password protection or password complexity or length, things like multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and federation, and things of that nature, to like not only protect your system, but to make your user's experience even better. These technologies don't purely exist to protect systems. They do make things more efficient as well, because you don't have to keep re-authenticating to a bunch of systems for that exact reason. Okay. So come to the conclusion, and some of the key points I really want to drive home is throughout this masterclass, we explored some of the fundamental concepts of identity management and its importance in today's digital landscape. From understanding some of the components of identity management and some of the best practices we spoke about, we've gained a lot of good insight into safeguarding some of this sensitive data that we're really trying to protect, but going back to the CIA triad. The importance of identity management and an effective solution for it cannot really be understated, both for the fact that it protects your data in a way that nothing else really does. It's a layer that goes through every security defense that there is, right? You can have as many firewalls, network intrusion, the best of the best, but if you don't have some kind of identity management, they can just come in through the front door and steal anything they want. Doesn't matter what else you implement. It could be the most secure network on the world. If it has weak authentication or identity management, somebody's just going to walk in through the front door and steal it. So that's the idea. And then we can assess our current management practices, try to make clear goals to improve what we have. So if you notice your organization is running an outdated password policy, or maybe they're running some kind of archaic or outdated version of an identity management system, because Active Directory and Entra are not the only ones that exist. They're some of the more popular ones, but there are a lot of other identity providers out there for all sorts of this stuff. We can learn from those things and try to upgrade or change the way we do things with that. And then always remember to prioritize user education for how they should be accessing their accounts, not writing down passwords and things like that, not leaving their tokens laying around, and train them. There's a lot of statistics out there that show that you can put as many of these things in place as you want, but if the user base is not trained to have best practices for managing identity as well, protecting their own identities so somebody's not impersonating them, then it kind of just doesn't do anything. So remember to prioritize education and training for your user bases as well. Does anybody have any questions for anything that we've talked about? We covered a lot of different stuff, from multi-factor authentication to identity management to single sign-on. There's been a lot. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. There's a lot of resources out there to go. If you go, I mean, you can just go straight to portal.azure.com. I'll put that in the chat here. You can go to portal.azure.com and sign up for a free portal instance as well to show you an example of this, a very quick example of this, to basically implement a identity management or show you what Entra looks like. It gives you like 6 months of access and $200 or something like that that you can play around with. And if you're a student, there's even more benefits like free services and so on. So there's a lot there that you can manage. So you can kind of consider that if you want to get more hands-on experience with this type of information or type of thing. Okay. All right, I'll open up to the floor one more time. If anybody has anything they'd like to discuss or have any questions for any of the material that I covered, or just a general question, I don't mind either. Okay, nothing heard, then I will stick around for a couple more minutes if anybody has any questions. I really appreciate everybody coming to this identity management masterclass, and we'll see you later.